Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for joining today's webinar. As introduced, I'm Nathan Wheat. I look after the VMware relationship from within AWS for Australia and New Zealand. And it's my role to talk to you today about VMware Cloud on AWS, the strategy that is behind the partnership and the strategy that your organisation would look at using the service for, and also just going through the service, what it's capable of, what it means for your business, and how to get started. So as I just mentioned, we will first go through an introduction of the service itself and where it fits into the cloud adoption journey. I'll also talk a little bit about the value proposition that it might have for your business and also for your IT department. I'll then talk about the use cases that we're seeing adopted around the world and some examples from customers using the use cases, using the service for those use cases, and also some recent announcements for the service that we've seen at VMworld. So starting off the process, I'll go through what the service is for. So we see that most organizations are on a cloud adoption journey and in their own pace, taking up cloud services for net new applications and doing migrations of their existing IT portfolio. However, we also know that 83% of the workloads that are out in the enterprise today are virtualized, by far the majority of those on VMware, and 60% of large enterprises are also running their workloads in a public cloud, a cloud service provider like AWS. Now, the challenge is that to date, most of those initiatives have been independent efforts. So we'll have in any given organization, maybe yours, a cloud team that will be attached to a particular application project or business line of business, adopting cloud independently of potentially the people running the VMware virtualized workloads, and the two don't necessarily get very well coordinated. So as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of businesses paying attention to that coordination between the two efforts, with IDC letting us know that there are 80% of organizations out there today who have a hybrid cloud strategy, and 90% of organizations predicted by Gartner are expected to have in place a hybrid cloud infrastructure by 2020, which is not particularly far away. The elements that are making up that hybrid cloud infrastructure, or that architecture, really consist of these four value points. So the first is that customers do see existing business in the on-premises environments that they have, and that's because applications have inherent complexity and they're established and will potentially still provide a lot of value where they are today for some time to come. Organizations also want to continue to grow new projects and move certain applications into cloud services, but they don't want those things to be independent, isolated from each other. So what organizations are chasing is that tight integration between the two initiatives so that they can adopt cloud, run the existing managed on-premises environment without the two being disjointed. And a lot of organizations, I'm not sure if this would apply to you and yours, a lot of organizations have decided that the last infrastructure refresh or facilities investment that they made won't be repeated in the future. And so many organizations are using a compelling event, such as when infrastructure comes up for renewal, to do something else. And it's difficult for organizations now to make a commitment of capital investment in their on-premises environment, whatever that investment may be, and be locked into that capacity and that capability for the next 3 to 5 years when so many things are changing around them. So this is where we see VMware and AWS uniquely coming together for a value proposition that hasn't really existed in the industry beforehand. So on the one side, we have VMware, which is the established leader in data center virtualization today. They have pioneered the concept of virtualization for x86 architectures and also the software-defined data center. And they're the de facto standard for running infrastructure services, probably in your organization if you're listening to this webcast. On the other side, we have AWS, which is the leader in cloud services in terms of scale, reach, the breadth of services. There are 130 plus services that AWS offers. And as a cloud provider, offers the flexible consumption economics of consuming on demand and providing that elasticity and that scale, which is very hard to do on premises. So the two organizations working together have created a jointly engineered solution that brings elements of both of those aspects together, because customers that we talk to are often adopting both of the technologies and wanting to have that bridge in between the two that joins the cloud world and infrastructure from VMware. So that enters the stage VMware Cloud on AWS, and that's represented on the diagram here as the architecture in the middle of the picture. And what it is the traditional VMware virtualization platform that you know and love, running on top of AWS global infrastructure and running in AWS data centers. So it's VMware vSphere, the hypervisor, running on top of bare metal hosts that are provided by AWS. It's not embedded virtualization running on top of EC2 or anything different to what you would have in your own data center. The storage is provided by VMware's vSAN technology, and the network virtualization for the VMware environment is provided by VMware NSX. Now, those three software components are actually the VMware Cloud Foundation, which is what a lot of customers have adopted on premises as well. So it is the same software that you know, and customers are provided with their own vCenter as a part of the service. But as you can see, there's a connection on the left hand of this diagram here, where customers can connect up their existing VMware environment to VMware Cloud on AWS and operate it as one seamless virtualized data center, one virtualized platform. So your existing staff skills can be used to leverage the AWS infrastructure, where VMware is that infrastructure service layer. On the other side, we have access to all of those 100 plus AWS services, which is connected natively to the VMware on AWS environment. And so that allows a whole host of new possibilities, which I'll come back to a little bit later. But it provides that bridge between extending the on-premises skills, the technology, and the application compatibility with VMware, but also the global reach, the infrastructure services, and the access to other cloud native services that most organizations are looking to get out of AWS and their digital innovation initiatives. There are 4 really key points that I want to impress upon everybody that's listening to this cast. And I'll go through each of those and the implications of what it means for your environment. The first is that it really is just VMware. So for those of you that have been running and operating VMware for the last decade or two, VMware is a well-established technology, and it's the same software platform that we're talking about in VMware Cloud on AWS. It's the same look and feel. It uses the same skill sets that your VMware engineers would be familiar with today, and they can still interact with vCenter and vSphere just like they do on premises. Now that means that you can take advantage of that existing skill set, but you can also be assured that if your applications are running today on VMware, they will run on this platform. There is no conversion required. You don't need to adapt it or modify the workloads in order for them to run on top of VMware Cloud on AWS. So unlike many cloud adoption journeys, in this case, we don't need to refactor or even rehost virtual machines onto a different platform. And in fact, that means that you as a customer can adopt the platform, try it out for a given project or a set of applications, and you can also move back. So it's a two-way door. And that lowers the cost and lowers the risk of moving workloads outside the data center, because it really is the same platform, just operating in a slightly different context with the AWS infrastructure. One of the other features which is really specific to this platform and quite unique in terms of cloud service providers is the ability to stretch your existing data center network from your data center and over to this VMware Cloud on AWS service. Now that means that you're able to also leverage things like vMotion and move applications from their existing data center context over a stretched layer 2 network to then exist inside of the AWS infrastructure without any changes to the network address for the application or without any changes to any of the network services around that virtual machine in order to get it migrated. Now, we see this used by most customers. Actually, it's one of the most prevalent features and compelling reasons for looking at this service is the complexity of understanding how to change the network context for long-established applications is actually really complicated and is a high-risk element for a lot of businesses looking to make any kind of a change. So I'll show you an example of a customer that used this to do a large-scale migration with no outage, no downtime. They were able to use vMotion without any disruption to their business services. The third key point that I want to impress on you is that it's also a part of AWS. So I am an AWS employee talking to you about VMware because it is a cloud service that's operated as a part of the joint partnership. But from your environment, it means that you have access to the rest of the AWS cloud services for extending and augmenting your applications and potentially having your applications go through their own evolution over time. Some of the services that make sense to connect up to the VMware environment here would be things like the Simple Storage Service, S3, or Elastic File System for providing data tiering of your not so hot data. So a lot of the environments that we see, there's a huge amount of information in the corporate environment which isn't actively used all the time, and so it makes sense to use tiered data storage services like S3 to store that information, to keep it available, but to do so much more cost effectively at the scale that it needs to be done. You might use network services like Application Load Balancer or Elastic Load Balancer. You might use some of the security services like Amazon Guard Duty or CloudFront to provide global acceleration of your web applications. And we can also use the multi-availability zone architecture of AWS to increase the availability of what you might have on premises. So through the integration with AWS services, we can have applications slowly modernize over time by augmenting themselves with additional services beyond the VMware environment. And then lastly, it is a cloud-based model. So as a customer, you would pay for the VMware hosts per hour for as long as you need them. It turns the capital expenditure conversation into consume on demand, and the environment is fully software driven. And one of the features I'll call out here is Elastic DRS, which was introduced fairly recently. And it's the ability for the cluster, the VMware cluster on AWS, to scale in and out depending on the virtual machine workloads that require those resources. So in an on-premises environment, you might have a cluster of, let's say, 10 VMware hosts because you need that at peak capacity. But a lot of the time, maybe 40% of that resource is actually used. In a service like this, you can have Elastic DRS maintain a base load of maybe 5 VMware hosts, providing what the business needs most of the time for the regular business day, and have Elastic DRS automatically add additional hosts when there are bursts and peaks in business demand or new projects coming on board, or maybe the release of a new application version. And you can have VMware host added within 10 to 12 minutes to your cluster, and you might go from 5 hosts to 10 in less than 15 minutes. And then when that capacity is no longer required, it'll scale that back down to whatever base load you need. So that's very different, and that's part of the cloud economics that businesses are looking to adopt when they move to cloud services. So on the back of that introduction, what is the value proposition for you? At the broader business level, I just wanted to reflect that most of the money that an organization will spend doesn't go to just the IT budget. So as measured by Deloitte here over recent years, somewhere between 2 and 7% of the business budget is allocated to IT, which is actually quite small relative to other spend. So if there's a way for cloud services, including VMware Cloud on AWS, to make a difference to the rest of the business expenditure, then that's really where we want to start the conversation. Some of those areas will be accelerating project timelines, because you can roll out traditional existing applications at a much faster rate and without the capital investment cycle that would be normally required on premises. That can support the increased rate of renovation and reduced cost of change, and therefore, if projects don't work out, you can easily spin them down and decommission those efforts, being a cloud-based model. And also for the business, the cost of the IT environment can mirror the consumption of what goes on in terms of business demand and business activities, and so provide a much closer fit of business effort and business projects to the IT bill and the IT consumption that goes with it. So that's the conversation at the higher level. But within the IT world, there are some changes that it would make in a real beneficial sense for your own IT budgets. The first obvious one is escaping that cycle of capital investment, which includes the infrastructure that needs to be replaced from time to time, whether that's every 3 or 5 years, depending on your particular appetite for change. But there's also other investments that are made in the data center itself. So implementing new rack space, having to upgrade power capacity for your environment, having to maybe roll out another air conditioning unit. Those are all things that are long-term investments, probably longer than the servers and the storage. And all of that capital means that for the peak capacity that you require, you need to have the investment there, but you're also locked into making use of that investment for the next 5 years or 10 years, depending on what it is that you're putting in place. And that's a trap that I think a lot of organizations get stuck into and find hard to escape. It can also help to redirect the IT time to much more business-focused value, such as working on business application releases, creating new customer experiences, and moving towards more agile groups, such as squads and tribes and so forth, and focusing effort away from just maintaining a shared infrastructure platform to really delivering business application value and delivering on that project demand. The other thing that's important to note is that it's a fully managed VMware platform. It's not just consuming some hosts as a service. It's managed and operated and maintained by VMware staff, an operational center of excellence. The platform is always patched, it's always upgraded, and it's always going to be on current hardware. And those are things that may or may not be true for your own environment. They take time and effort to maintain, and it's easy to maybe delay an upgrade or delay a patch, or to be maybe missing some alerts, some proactive health alerts prior to failure. In this case, it's all managed for you by VMware operational staff that are dedicated to it. And therefore, the environment is always going to be healthy. As soon as one of the operational staff notices a warning from a fan or a CPU or a memory module going wrong, they will proactively introduce a new host into your cluster, move workloads off the unhealthy failing host, and recycle that hardware back into the AWS data center management fleet. And by that, you'll always be on an environment that's maintained for you, and that reduces cost and risk. And then the other thing is also reducing the cost that it takes to move out of your existing on-premises environment and accelerate that cloud migration effort that you might be facing. So, and that means really bringing forward the cloud migration timelines and separating the data center exit from the application change that usually is involved with cloud migrations. So I'll go through a story of a customer that explains this very well shortly, but it's about timeline acceleration, de-risking the change of moving to a cloud-based model by really having VMware provide a zero change migration path, and being able to decompose the migration process and allow your organization to go through that change in a much more measured pace with lower risk. The service is consumed in a cloud-like model, as I said. It's available on demand, so you can pay by the hour per vSphere host and have consumption-based billing that way. If you have a predictable demand or maybe a base load that you know will always be used, then just like AWS reserved instances, you can pre-purchase capacity at 1 or 3 year commitment timelines, and we probably see a combination of both will make sense. The service is sold, managed, supported and operated by VMware themselves, so AWS is 100% behind the service, but it's a VMware fronted service. And so you would procure the service through VMware or the VMware partner community via hybrid cloud credits, hybrid purchase program or service purchase program, or through traditional purchase orders or even a credit card. And there's also a hybrid loyalty program. So if I'm speaking to you, you probably have VMware licensing already. VMware acknowledges that customers have made that investment in their existing environments and with VMware. And so they provide some recognition of your investment through the hybrid loyalty program, which is a discount of the rate of VMware Cloud on AWS according to what licenses you may already own. So if you have 10 CPUs of vSphere Enterprise Plus, they will discount the rate of VMware Cloud by 10% for those 10 CPUs. The same thing for vSAN and the same thing for NSX. And you don't need to trade in those licenses and stop using it. It's just a recognition of the investment that you've already made. But you would I would recommend you speak to VMware about the circumstances that fit your consumption and environment. So that's an overview of the service. I now want to talk about the use cases that we're seeing. So the collaboration was announced over 2 years ago, and the service was first launched in the US in reInvent, Amazon reInvent 2017. And we've recently announced it in Australia, but it's been around for some time. And we've seen some trends that we see, some common trends that customers are following. These are the 4 main use cases that we observe out in the industry. The first being cloud migrations, what customers are looking to adopt with this service. About 40% of the demand for VMware Cloud and AWS is for customers that are looking to exit their data centers or consolidate and reduce their data center footprint or do some other broad scale migration away from on-premises. And so the ability to migrate rapidly and quickly is what's attracting those customers, and there's by far a majority of interest from that area. The second is data center extension, and this is about 30% of the customer demand is for extending the existing data center capacity to the cloud service. And this is potentially those that are going to stay on premises for some time, or potentially customers that have an on-premises investment that they need to maintain and sweat those assets for the next 18 months or 2 years or whatever the time scale is. But any new project and any new capacity demand can extend over to VMware Cloud and AWS. And so we see that through new projects being deployed out to the cloud, test and development cycles, which can be transient, they can come and go in terms of scale, and things like virtual desktops, which I'll talk about as well. The third category is disaster recovery. That's just shy of 20% demand, maybe 15 to 20% demand, is for secondary data centers where customers may not have adequate DR capability, and they can very easily establish that in VMware Cloud on AWS. But customers can also replace their existing lower demand data centers like DR and put that over to the cloud with probably fewer business challenges than doing a production data center. We also have multiple DR topologies that we can support. So I'll circle back to disaster recovery because I think there's a lot more customers that are starting their inquiries down that path if they don't have the compelling event for maybe a data center renewal or a massive cloud migration. And the last category, which I think is more strategic than the others because it impacts business application owners, is about hybrid application architectures. And this is where existing VMware-based applications can be extended out to cloud services for instance, using cloud network and security, data analytics. Somebody might set up a data pipe between an existing VMware-based application and Amazon's Redshift data warehousing capabilities, or any number of services that are out there. So we're seeing the hybridity of not only the infrastructure, but the applications themselves is starting to pick up interest. Talking about the data center evacuation, so one of the things that was announced at VMworld in the US this year was CloudMotion. And this is building on the existing capability to vMotion workloads out of the existing data center, but at a huge scale of thousands of virtual machines being managed at a time. It's the combination of data replication and vMotion, which has been around for about 15 years now, I think, so that the coordination of workloads being evacuated from the data center can be done in a much finer control than what you would normally have with vMotion. So it's managed through a tool called Hybrid Cloud Extension, which is provided with this service for free. It has been around for other types of migration cases and other services in the past, but it's being included at no cost for VMware Cloud and AWS. And it joins up your existing on-premises environment, which may be on a different vCenter version and maybe on a different vSphere version, with VMware Cloud on AWS, and can actually manage both the visibility of workloads across the two, but also the migration and the joining of those networks. That network extension that I talked about, the layer 2 extension, is established and maintained by Hybrid Cloud Extensions. And so we're seeing the acceleration of migration from even the examples that I can tell you to much faster and much broader scale over time. One of the great examples of a customer that's performed a large-scale migration into VMware Cloud on AWS is MIT, an educational institution out of the US. They had a mandate to move all of their workloads away from their data centers and adopt cloud services. And they ended up migrating just shy of 3,000 virtual machines to VMware Cloud on AWS. And they did the first 200 of those within 96 hours, so a handful of days. And they had hundreds of virtual machines already running on the service. The whole exercise for the rest of the 3,000 virtual machines was something like 45 days project time. Now, that's extremely rapid, and they were able to go through that process one network segment at a time by extending the existing network architecture from their data center over to VMware Cloud on AWS, migrate batches of workloads with zero downtime and in some cases minimal coordination with application owners, and have them continue to run and not change because of the migration, because essentially all they're doing is relocating. They're not going through any change. And then once that set of networks was migrated, they would contract them so that they would live just on AWS and then move to the next batch. And so they were able to rapidly go through that workload set with no disruption and very quickly get out of their existing data center situation. I also mentioned disaster recovery as a service. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations that are looking at bolstering their disaster recovery capabilities or establishing ones that they don't have by using VMware Cloud on AWS as an on-demand service. So those of you that have some familiarity with VMware, you may have heard of Site Recovery Manager in the past. This has been around for about 10 years, in fact, and it helps organizations with the recovery orchestration of a disaster recovery plan. Now, Site Recovery Manager has evolved and supports VMware Cloud on AWS, and it can be used either on its own to recover on-premises workloads over to the VMware Cloud service. It can also be used in reverse, and you can fail over workloads from the cloud-based service back to on-premises. Now, that's something that's fairly unique. When we talk about disaster recovery to cloud, most of the conversations to date have talked about going from one type of infrastructure to another type of infrastructure, which is fine, except when it comes to the scenario of failing back post-disaster, and now those workloads have changed twice. So the workloads that you have post-disaster have actually gone through quite a bit of change, and that change is not at zero risk and is not necessarily 100% guaranteed to work for all workloads. So the scenario here is hugely attractive because they're going from a virtual machine to another virtual machine, still running on VMware, and when they fail back post-disaster, the workload itself hasn't changed. You're getting back the same workload that you left with. The topologies that I mentioned before, this is some of the new stuff that's been announced. So we support, as I said, disaster recovery from on-premises over to the AWS infrastructure and in reverse. We can also support disaster recovery from one cloud availability zone to another. So you could have an environment 100% purely in VMware Cloud and AWS and still have traditional disaster recovery management for those VMware-based machines from availability zone to availability zone or from region to region if that was the business requirement. We can also support other topologies like fanning out. So you could have your on-premises environment replicate both to, or have some workloads replicating off to a secondary data center and others replicating to VMware Cloud. We can also have multiple data centers replicating in to VMware Cloud and AWS. And so that really opens up almost all combinations of how you might want to enact disaster recovery planning for your business environment. It's very easy to set up. It's an add-on service. You only pay per protected virtual machine, and it uses vSphere replication. So it really doesn't matter what storage technology you're using on site today. It's happening at the hypervisor level, at vSphere's level. And the other thing that makes this very different, which applies not only to disaster recovery, but just general production capacity as well, is that the environment can rapidly increase. So in a disaster recovery sense, you might have a minimal environment to support your most mission critical workloads. And then during an actual disaster event, you can have the environment expand within that 10 to 15 minute window to take on additional workloads if you're in a disaster mode for an extended period of time, upwards of a day or more. An example of a customer that did exactly that was Scripps Networks. That's a subsidiary of the Discovery Group, so Discovery Channel and so forth. They're a media organization and they didn't have adequate disaster recovery to start with. They moved that capability to VMware Cloud on AWS, and they use a combination of two different approaches to be most cost effective. The first layer of their disaster recovery was for their mission critical workloads using Site Recovery Manager. And that allowed them to have a recovery time objective, within minutes. They could spin up virtual machines in that mission critical set in a managed, coordinated way as you get out of Site Recovery Manager. And so they would have trees of dependencies or a hierarchy of dependency and have their mission critical workloads up very, very rapidly on the cloud-based service. For their lower tier applications, and this is probably by far the majority of their applications, they didn't require such rapid recovery, but if they needed to be recovered, they still needed a strategy. And so they used their existing data protection partner, in this case Veritas NetBackup, which was providing Amazon S3 based backups. And so for the rest of the application fleet, they were able to do a restore on demand approach for those non-critical workloads, things that needed a recovery time, say beyond 4 or 6 hours, which is a lot of applications in an environment. And they could rehydrate their VMware environment by expanding that minimal cluster to start with, up to as many vSphere hosts as were required to restore the rest of the environment. So that meant they were able to end up with a reliable, testable, auditable disaster recovery capability, still fully VMware compatible, and able to be demonstrated to the business, but they weren't paying for a full replica of production all the time. So that's hopefully something that you might be looking at for your organization. One of the other use cases of the service is for Horizon, virtual desktop infrastructure. So this was also announced at VMworld Europe recently. VMworld Europe recently announced the addition of instant clone capability. So this is the extension of what you might already have for VMware Horizon on premises over to a different resource pod. So VMware Cloud on AWS is essentially just a provider of resources for your existing Horizon VDI that you might use in conjunction with your on-premises capability. And we're seeing some customers roll out these virtual desktops to, I guess, different user profiles and different user locations. One organization is investigating this capability for connecting up their on-premises staff and their on-premises users with the ability to also roll out virtual desktops to users that are all around the world. And there's smaller numbers of users in each individual location, but they can roll out this Horizon-based platform to any AWS region that offers the VMware Cloud service. And so in this case, they still manage their Horizon connection and management infrastructure. They still provide their desktop management or image management as they would today on premises, but they now have global reach. They now have geo-resilience if their on-premises infrastructure goes down, so it's a part of their disaster recovery strategy. And they're able to connect up locality closer to some of the users that exist outside of their headquarters and physical locations. So this is something that's evolving quickly. And as I said, the introduction recently of instant clones makes that a lot more efficient, and the ability to rapidly scale out desktops in seconds, as opposed to even the minutes that VMware is able to provide normally. And the last use case that I mentioned was about application hybrid architecture. And this is where you would combine maybe traditional VMware-based applications with the native capabilities provided by AWS Cloud Services. Now, this diagram here shows you the nature of the connection between the two. When a customer deploys VMware Cloud on AWS, it will prompt the customer for an associated customer-owned AWS account. So on the left-hand side is an environment that's owned and offered through VMware, which is managed on behalf of the customer, but is actually a VMware-controlled environment running your VMware-based virtual machines. But on the other side, you have your customer-owned AWS VPC already in existence, and the cluster will create a high-speed interconnect between the two different AWS accounts for you automatically. And that interconnect is through the 25 gigabit elastic network interfaces that are attached to each vSphere host. And so the virtual machines actually have access with high throughput and almost no latency, because we're in the same availability zone and the same AWS infrastructure, to be able to use storage services, to use relational database service, to use maybe native web servers that are running on Amazon EC2 or other types of services that are out there. So this allows the preservation of business value in the applications that you already own, but extending the capability of what they could do with maybe machine learning, data analytics, network services that are out there that the application wouldn't natively be able to do on its own. So as I mentioned, I think this has a much greater and longer term value for organizations, because it's able to evolve, help organizations evolve their application fleet, and again, bring down the granularity of evolution to application components as opposed to shifting an entire application and its dependencies. So I've made a few references to the new things that are being announced. The VMware Cloud and AWS service is rapidly evolving. It's now been around for, I guess, 14 months in the field, and it goes through a cycle of release approximately every 90 days. And so we're currently just in the middle of the 6th release of this service. VMworld Europe, a couple of weeks ago, or last week I should say, announced yet another round of service updates, regions, and features. So I'll just mention a couple of those highlights here. in terms of the runtime ability of customers to get started, VMware has lowered the entry price from a minimum of 4 hosts that needed to be consumed originally, and customers can now get started by getting 3 hosts, but for the price of 2. And so that effectively halves the entry price, not only for small customers, but also any customer that wants to get started and experiment. And so it becomes much more attractive to start with a smaller infrastructure and then grow from there. VMware's also announced the ability for Amazon EBS to provide the underlying storage, which I haven't gone into any technical details, but that essentially provides a high capacity storage type, because we're seeing a lot of customers with huge amounts of storage on premises that they look to VMware Cloud and AWS and they see that it's hyper-converged, and therefore maybe they have higher storage requirements than the platform delivers natively or by default. And so we're adapting to that by providing new types of storage instances and new types of compute nodes that give different amounts of storage that customers can have control over them for their own environments. We also announced the integration of VMware's NSX-T variant into the service, and that's opened up the door to a couple of things. One of those is micro-segmentation, and that's the ability that NSX already provides on premises of providing firewalling at the virtual machine level. So that's not only securing traffic that goes through a traditional firewall, so the perimeter of your network, but every time a packet enters or leaves a virtual machine's network interface, it can be inspected and subject to security rules. And you use policies that are based on tags or based on virtual machine names or potentially other types of attributes about your platform to dictate the correct behaviors that you would like to have applications follow, which is disconnected and different from the network topology. And that gives the ability for security to be done in a completely different way and a completely different level of scrutiny and detail than what people have normally done. We've also integrated Amazon Direct Connect, AWS Direct Connect, with VMware Cloud on AWS. So we're able to utilize a customer's existing Direct Connect for both management, compute workloads, and other AWS native accounts. And so that was constrained in the past, and now that's been integrated, so we're allowed to use, or we're now able to use that capability across all use cases. And on the protection side, I mentioned about multiple disaster recovery topologies. So yet more topologies were announced at VMworld Europe last week. We're seeing an increase of the scale, that the numbers of virtual machines that have been validated for the disaster recovery capability is now in the many thousands. And we're seeing hybrid cloud disaster recovery with on-premises vCloud foundations, such as VxRail-based environments. I mentioned about the AWS regions that are receiving the service. So currently AWS has 18 global regions, and as of this week, Tokyo was just announced, and that brings the total number of regions up to 9. So we now have 9 global regions around AWS infrastructure's footprint, where customers can access VMware Cloud and AWS. But we also have at the VMworld events pre-announced the time scales over which the other regions will be available, and you can see those here on the slide. So we're planning that by the end of 2019, I should say, almost all of the regions that AWS runs cloud services will have VMware Cloud on AWS. But most importantly for this audience, it's in Australia and accessible for customers and organizations in our region. An interesting service that was also announced was Amazon RDS on VMware. So this is actually the reverse type of relationship where Amazon is offering a cloud-based, highly managed application service onto a customer's on-premises VMware environment. So this is still in preview. In the VMworld US, it was announced and launched into a preview mode. And as we see this service become generally available, I'll actually be very interested to hear feedback from you on what the use cases are. But some of the ones that make sense are the ability to transform an on-premises database to a managed database service without having to move that database. So the database transformation becomes a slightly different value proposition there, but also the ability to extend an on-premises database, maintain that as the master source, but have read-only replicas distributed around the AWS global infrastructure. So you may have customer-facing applications which can use that distributed information, but you don't want to have the control of that data leave your on-premises environments where you have the ability to put an axe through a cable or close the data center rules. So the governance profile doesn't need to change, but the access to that environment can be greatly accelerated. So I'm just checking time. Looking at how to get started. So my recommendation to everybody on the call is to maybe start with a paper-based exercise. And please call on your VMware team and your AWS team to help you with this estimation. But there's a tool that's online called vmcsizer.vmware.com, and it's able to take the output of, or your inputs, sorry, that you would get from a tool like RV Tools, and give you an estimate of how big you would need your VMware Cloud cluster to be in order to take the given workloads that you're considering. And it can actually follow on from that sizing estimation to give you a TCO model. And there's a small screenshot of that on the screen here. And of course, it's a general model that may or may not apply to your business, but at least it will give you a starting point to look at what are the types of considerations for the cost of the service, what's it offsetting compared to your business's usual situation today? Are you taking into account your network infrastructure, your switches and so forth? Are you taking into account the labor that you need to operate the environment? So they're just inputs into your own TCO calculations. So very rapid exercise, we're able to turn around an answer of what the environment should cost you very rapidly through that. If you wanted to go into the next level of detail, then there is a free migration assessment available through VMware's Cost Insight tool. You can download a virtual appliance from VMware's website, and it will measure the workloads that you want it to look at and give you a sizing based on the actual workload demand. So another layer of detail over the top of just a paper-based exercise. And you can also combine that assessment with vRealize Network Insight. Now, that's not a free tool, so please do talk to your VMware representatives about that one. But it is able to measure and map the network flows and the way that applications are communicating with each other currently in on-premises. And that'll inform your plans of two things. One is how you might group your application dependencies and your migration phases. But also, when you land on a cloud services environment, you're probably going to put into place, as I said, the micro-segmentation rules and security groups. And so understanding in detail exactly how applications are communicating will help you with defining those network and security rules. And so that's certainly a great way to understand your current environment. And finally, if you have a complex business case, if you have complex migration needs, you're going to need the help of people outside your organization. VMware has a partnership competency program that they offer to the VMware partner ecosystem, and most of those are also in common with the AWS partner network. And so there are approximately 18 organizations, most of which are shown up here on this slide, that have achieved that competency and demonstrated their knowledge and skills in VMware Cloud on AWS. And so I encourage you, if you're working with some of these partners today, they can assist you with creating a business case and a plan to migrate from on-premises, help you with migration assessment, workload suitability assessment, migration planning, and also in many cases, managed services. So if you currently have a third party managing your applications and your infrastructure services, you may continue to have a relationship that builds on top of VMware Cloud on AWS to provide additional services at the operating system or application level to build out the service as you need. So with that, I'm running bang on time pretty much. So please continue to send in your questions, and hopefully Ashish has been answering those as you've gone through the webinar. My encouragement to you all is look at getting started today. It's a cloud-based service. It's consumed on demand, and so there's no lock-in. We recommend that you go through the paper-based exercise to give yourself an order of magnitude understanding of what your VMware Cloud environment might look like if you head down that path. And there's also available to all customers a single node starter configuration. Now, this is not a full VMware Cloud cluster. It's a single vSphere node, but in every other aspect, it's running the same services and in the same context as a full production service. With the absence of cluster level features like vMotion or vSphere HA, because it's a standalone node. Now, we have a time limit on how long we want customers to use that for, essentially so that you don't get tempted to run production workloads on it long term, because it doesn't have cluster level resilience that we want people to have in the service. But it is a cost reduced way, so it's cheaper than running even the per node price of a full production cluster. But it gives you an easy way to experiment with the service, connect it up to your on-premises vCenter if you wish, connect it up to your AWS native account if you wish, and move some workloads over to it and see if your needs can be met, if the performance is right, if you can add AWS services to your existing virtual machines. And at any time during that 30-day trial process, you can scale that up to a full 3, 4, 8 node cluster, whatever you need. But if you end up at the end of the 30 days, then the environment will be taken down and decommissioned for you. And the last thing I'll leave you with is please reach out to your VMware account managers, your VMware engineers, reach out to your AWS account managers and your AWS solution architects. We are jointly behind this service, and capability and awareness is there on both sides of the fence. So whomever you reach out to next, please talk to them about VMware Cloud on AWS, where it might make sense for your cloud adoption journey, where it might make sense for helping you with your on-premises environment and giving your business agility, innovation, and flexibility that everybody's looking at today. And let us help you with that journey, connect you to the right partners, and help you with those first steps and ultimately your success. And so with that, please let the questions continue to roll in. We'll take some of the questions from the audience today. Sharon, are you there?
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for your presentation. We'll now be beginning the Q&A section. So like Nathan said, keep the questions rolling in. We do have our initial question, which is, does AWS support third-party software when servers are running in AWS VPC? Does it come under AWS responsibility, or is it the customer's responsibility?
Right, okay, that's a great question. I guess the consulting answer is it depends. So as I said, in the context of today's webinar, we have both VMware Cloud on AWS and we have the regular AWS services. Applications that are running on the VMware Cloud on AWS, that account and that technology basis is essentially seen as VMware. And so application vendors, if they support VMware today, in all likelihood, they won't see any difference whatsoever because the platform is the same software stack that they're used to today. So you'll see compatibility statements really from the VMware side and the support process from VMware's service operational staff. And the support process is something else that I haven't really spoken about, but it's greatly accelerated from what VMware customers have seen today. If those applications are running on the AWS native side, then there's also an ecosystem, a lot of the same vendors that support AWS cloud services. And so it really does depend, unfortunately, on where that application runs. And if it's running a little bit on both sides, then the application vendor will probably support those components running on each side.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan. So we do have a second question as well. Can you expand on how MIT extended virtual LANs across to AWS? You said they expanded then shrank those networks. Is that done on a layer 2 connection using direct connects with NSX? Also, what other requirements would be needed?
Great question. So now in the case of MIT, they had an existing AWS Direct Connect. I think it was quite a high speed one, probably a 10 gig connection. I don't have a full inventory of what they had in place, but that's my understanding. The layer 2 extension is using technology from VMware NSX, but it doesn't require a customer to have NSX on premises. So in the case of MIT, they used the network extension capability of HCX, and it deploys a virtual appliance on premises. So that virtual appliance is essentially a layer 2 gateway. It's a layer 2 bridge that is attached to the VLANs that you nominate, the virtual network and the vNetwork distributed switch that you have in your VMware environment. And it provides a layer 2 proxy and bridge over to the AWS side of the house. So yes, it's a layer 2 extension. It manages things like MAC address advertising and broadcast domain. So it's an intelligent bridge. It's not just essentially a piece of virtual wire. And the requirements for it. So as I said, you don't need NSX. You do need to have a vNetwork distributed switch, but that doesn't need to be for your entire environment. You can have a part of your environment that has the distributed switches, and it'll work with those. And that's about it. It doesn't require direct connect. We've had customers migrate over essentially a software and internet routed VPN, but it really depends on your bandwidth and your speed requirements and what's available to you through that path. But we recommend, if you're heading down this path, you really should be considering direct connect. It's probably the better way to go.
Thanks, Nathan. We have an additional question. Can I have multiple VMware clusters in the service?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely, you can. So there are a couple of constructs inside the service. So as a customer, you create different organizations. You can have essentially as many of those as you like. Within an organization, you create a software-defined data center, an SDDC, and that, in theory, would represent a location, like a region. And again, you can have as many of those as you like. Now, within a given region or a given SDDC, you can deploy up to 10 VMware clusters in that same area. And there's nothing stopping you. Say, for instance, just in the Sydney region, you could create 2 SDDCs. So it doesn't mean that you're constrained to 10 clusters per region. It's 10 clusters per SDDC. So effectively, yes, you can have many clusters up to the scale of the biggest customers that I would imagine.
Hey, Nathan. Thanks for that. So the last question that we'll be doing today is, with migration between VMware Cloud and AWS, would services such as EC2 import or server migration service need to be used, or are there other alternatives? My scenario is copy dev environment from VMware Cloud to AWS.
Mm-hmm. Okay, in order to use VMware Cloud on AWS, no, those tools aren't actually needed or involved. So the mechanism to move from your existing VMware on-premises environment to VMware Cloud on AWS, there's actually a few different paths you could take. One is you could just do a standard vMotion, cross-center vMotion through vCenter itself. Now that avenue is completely available. However, you take on a little bit more work doing it that way. The best migration tool is Hybrid Cloud Extension. And that provides, as I've mentioned before, that network bridge, but it also connects the vCenters and helps to manage the migration. So you could do a cold migration if you're able to turn the virtual machines off for a period of time and migrate the data during a maintenance window. Or you can do, as I mentioned, the most attractive option is doing live migrations facilitated through HCX. Now, if you want to continue down your cloud migration path and end up having those virtual machines on native Amazon EC2, you could continue to use the import EC2 import service, or you could use the Amazon migration service to then do that secondary migration away from VMware Cloud on AWS and over to native EC2. So you could use those tools, but that would be, I guess, after you move to VMware Cloud on AWS, but not necessary. Great. Well, I think that that brings us to the end of our Q&A. I really appreciate everybody's time joining the webinar today. I hope you've gotten information of value to you, and please do let us know your questions. Reach out to your Amazon reps, and I'll hand back to Sharon to close up. Thank you.
Thanks again, Nathan. So we would like to thank you again for joining us at today's VMware Cloud